Hi, I'm Josh. I haven't done a book review in quite a while because I've been reading through an entire trilogy. When I start reading a story, I don't like to break it up just because of how the publisher has arbitrarily decided to split it up into multiple books or whatever. I like to read it from start to finish and then review it before I move on. So I have been focused on the Regeneration trilogy, which is a series that was spoken of highly by a booktuber named Brian from the booktube channel Bookish or Bookish Texan. I'll link his channel below. He's somebody who I think has a lot of great things to say on YouTube, and so when he recommended this series, I thought I'd pick it up and give it a try. Thank you so much to my Patreon supporters for giving me the ability to even pick up books and purchase them, because my life becomes increasingly challenged as cost of living continues to rise. So thank you so much to my Patreon supporters. This trilogy is made up of obviously 3 books. The first one called Regeneration, published in 1991. Then the second book, The Eye in the Door. And then the third one, The Ghost Road, was published in 1995. When I give plot summaries of books, I try to give as little information as possible because I personally like to go into books knowing as little as possible, which is what I did for this series. And imagine my surprise when I found out that this is not your typical war novel in terms of following soldiers at the front during battle and so forth, but is instead an exploration of a topic that is very near and dear to my life, which is PTSD, or in these early days of discovery, what is called shell shock, I suppose. There's not really much of a plot for me to spoil. Really what this book does is it follows the lives of people associated with the Craig Lockhart War Hospital in Edinburgh, Scotland in the later years of World War I in 1917 and 1918. And we don't get to any of the actual frontline fighting until the last few chapters of the last book. Instead, what it does is it follows one of the psychiatrists at the Craig Lockhart Hospital, a fellow named Dr. Rivers, and a few of his patients are also primary characters in the book, and he has several other patients who are more of secondary characters. And it follows the physician as he attempts to explore this phenomenon of PTSD, as well as the patients that he's treating and the impact of his treatment and the impact of the war on these patients. What's interesting is that the author, Pat Barker, takes real-life events and real-life characters and weaves them in with fictional characters and fictional events. And at the end of books 1 and 2, the author takes some time to break down which specific characters and events were true to life, were taken from the hospital records, and then which ones were just fictional. The other thing that sort of adds to this idea that there isn't a very strong through line of plot throughout the series is that we actually have shifting main characters throughout the 3 books. So the one, I guess, consistent, mostly main character is Dr. Rivers, the psychiatrist. And in book 1, the other main character is one of his patients, a fellow named Sassoon, who is a veteran war objector who Dr. Rivers is treating at the hospital. However, in books 2 and 3, Sassoon is barely even mentioned any longer. And at the beginning of book 2, a different patient who was sort of a secondary character, but a fairly, could be a primary character as well. A fellow named Pryor, who did show up in book 1, but becomes sort of the main character in book 2, and we actually leave behind Rivers for a while as well as we follow Pryor's life and events, although River does come very strongly back into the picture again later in book 2 and throughout book 3. And in book 3 we continue with this storyline of Pryor and Rivers as being sort of the primary characters in the book. So just because a character is prominent in the first book doesn't mean they'll really be hardly mentioned in the next books going forward. So it's an interesting book in that it is very much a character study and a study of themes, but there's not this idea of this overarching goal or quest that people are necessarily working towards, if that makes any sense. Now, these books are extremely well written. Pat Barker has done a really great job with not only the technical aspects of the prose, but in telling the story and in weaving these themes throughout the narrative. And honestly, every time I come to, I guess, more literary fiction type books, I feel even worse about the fantasy genre as a whole and the quality of writing I encounter so frequently in the fantasy genre. Not that there isn't great writing in fantasy, but it adds to my frustration. Little tangent there, but just a really quick example of the type of good writing you'll find in these books. In this scene, we have a soldier who is waiting for a train to bring him back to the front, and he is waiting alongside his girlfriend, and they are feeling this awkward moment of wanting this horrible moment to be over with, for the train to get there and get on with things. And the book says, he glanced covertly at his watch. Where was the bloody train? And then he saw it, in the distance, crawling doubtfully along, trailing its plume of steam. No sound yet, though as he stepped closer to the edge of the platform, he felt or sensed a vibration in the rails. He turned to face Sarah, blocking her view of the train. She was looking at the rafters. Have you seen them? He followed her gaze and saw that every raptor? He followed her gaze and saw that every rafter was lined with pigeons. The warmth, I suppose, he said vaguely. The roar of the approaching train startled the birds. They rose as one, streaming out from under the glass roof in a great flapping and beating of wings, wheeling, banking, swooping, turning, a black wave against the smoke-filled sky. Pryor and Sarah watched, open-mouthed, drunk on the sight of so much freedom, their linked hands slackening, able finally to think of nothing as the train steamed in. And the chapter closes there. So, yeah, really excellent writing. But the bulk of this review is going to be talking about the really interesting themes that the books examine. And so the main things I'm going to look at are PTSD as being kind of the main overarching theme here. We're going to talk about war versus healing, and civilians and the nation as a response to war. We're going to talk about Christianity and pacifism, class divides, homosexuality and bisexuality, and finally what the book is ultimately all about. And these are going to be divided up into chapters, so if you want to skip any of these and just go to the interesting stuff, feel free to do so. Now, like I said, even though war has always had a mental impact on its participants, this really came to the forefront during the First World War. And so we have the term shell shock being coined during this period of time to describe the symptoms that were being experienced by a lot of its participants. And so one thing that the doctor in this novel, the psychiatrist Dr. Rivers, is trying to figure out is, why is this happening? And he comes up with a few different reasons here that are very interesting and really help to explain why this shell shock or PTSD became such an issue during the First World War in particular, and of course continues on to this day to modern warfare. In talking to one of his patients, Rivers says, "You're thinking of breakdown as a reaction to a single traumatic event, but it's not like that. It's more a matter of erosion, weeks and months of stress in a situation where you can't get away from it." Piling on top of that is this other factor that one of the soldiers who is a patient of Dr. Rivers is talking about when he says, "As far as I can make out, Rivers' theory is that the crucial factor in accounting for the vast number of breakdowns this war has produced is not the horrors, war has always produced plenty of those, but the fact that the strain has to be borne in conditions of immobility, passivity, and helplessness, cramped in holes in the ground waiting for the next random shell to put you out." And he goes on to talk about how what they were expecting was more open mobile warfare and how it had all changed during the First World War when they just kind of dug down in trenches. And then the third factor here is more of a deep down societal factor that affects men in particular and sort of preps them to be affected in this manner. One of the things Dr. Rivers was doing in his experimental treatments of shell shock was to try to get his patients to talk about their experiences, to talk through what had happened, how they had emotionally reacted to it, why they had reacted to it, and so forth. And so Dr. Rivers, narrating here, says, "In leading his patients to understand that breakdown was nothing to be ashamed of, that horror and fear were inevitable responses to the trauma of war and were better acknowledged than suppressed, that feelings of tenderness for other men were natural and right, that tears were an acceptable and helpful part of grieving, he was setting himself against the whole tenor of their upbringing. They'd been trained to identify emotional repression as the essence of manliness. Men who broke down or cried or admitted to feeling fear were sissies, weaklings, failures, not men. And yet he himself was a product of the same system, even perhaps a rather extreme product." So he goes on to talk about he himself has been affected in the very same manner, saying, certainly the rigorous repression of emotion and desire had been the constant theme of his adult life. In advising his young patients to abandon the attempt at repression and to let themselves feel the pity and terror their war experience inevitably evoked, he was excavating the ground he stood on. So those were three interesting factors that Dr. Rivers was learning about and trying to use this knowledge in the way he approached his treatments. Obviously, with my own PTSD experiences, largely brought on by my paramedic career, which there is very much obviously parallel between the type of PTSD experienced by paramedics and that experienced by soldiers in combat. When you have people's lives depending on you, and so often you really can't do anything about it despite your best efforts. There was obviously a lot I related to. A lot of it I cut out here for the sake of time, but just a few things I'll mention that really kind of struck me as something that I related to in a very personal manner. The first is the fact that I grew up with chronic illnesses. I had Crohn's disease from quite a young age. I grew up in an environment that instilled a lot of fear and depression and mental, anxiety and poor mental health into me as well. But I was very, very determined that no matter what physical and mental limitations I was experiencing, I was going to just go ahead in life and do what I set my mind to and accomplish that. And so I got into this paramedic career, a very stressful, high physically and mentally demanding type of job, despite the limitations I had, and pushed through it for a solid 16 years. And we have one of the soldiers in the mental hospital, as they refer to it, who has a history of asthma, and he is talking about similar limitations and how he tries to push through it. And he's saying, it's just that I've never let the asthma stop me. I was ordered to stay out of those gas huts. I was quite prepared to go through them. Even as a child, I was determined it wasn't going to stop me. I could do anything the others did, and not only that, I could beat them. I'm not suggesting this is peculiar to me. I think most asthmatics are like that. But obviously, no matter how mentally or physically tough you think you are, eventually things are going to catch up with you. And so when my doctor finally convinced me of the fact that I could no longer be an effective worker and had to stop working, I was extremely reluctant to admit that. And the emotions that are described here are very much emotions that I can relate to. So we have the patients here at Craig Lockhart Hospital who are all victims of the war in terms of the PTSD they are experiencing, as well as their physical injuries on top of that. And in describing one of these patients, it says, like most of the patients at Craig Lockhart, he suffered from a deep sense of shame and failure. And my goodness, those are things that I can relate to ever since I had to admit that I could no longer work. I had to go on disability, no longer be a functioning, contributing member of society, as it were. I have carried this very deep sense of shame and failure to the point where I really dislike meeting new people, because the first thing anyone asks you when they meet you is, so what do you do? Well, I'm on disability, and so what do I do? It's a shameful thing to admit, especially if I were to meet another paramedic and have to say, yeah, I worked as a paramedic for 16 years, but now I can't. It's awfully embarrassing. And then the final thing I relate to here is we have another soldier who is going through his home later in the war, and it says his damaged house leaked memories of Jane and the children, and of himself too, as he had been before the war. Memories so vivid in comparison with his present depleted self that he found himself moving between pieces of shrouded furniture like his own ghost. And that last bit, like his own ghost, I got to a point where I really felt like I was dead. I was no longer living, which led me to discover something called Cotard syndrome. But that is something that also stuck out to me. Moving on to the next theme of war versus healing, one of the primary conflicts that our main character, Dr. Rivers, has is the fact that he is being sent these patients from the battlegrounds who are mentally injured with this PTSD, and his job is to get them to a point of sanity and normal function in order to push them back out to the front lines to get them fighting the war again. And so he's got this conflict of he's trying to cure these soldiers to put them straight back into the insanity that, if it doesn't get them killed, is probably going to ruin them mentally again. And so early on in the book, it says, Rivers was aware, as a constant background to his work, of a conflict between his belief that the war must be fought to a finish for the sake of the succeeding generations, and his horror that such events as those which led to Burns' breakdown should be allowed to continue. Rivers continues to struggle with this later in the book, and in this instance, he's comparing his own treatments of the soldiers versus another psychiatrist. Now, Rivers, I guess his specialty was in treating officers, and so he used more Freudian psychology and talk therapy and more gentle approaches to treatment than his colleague, this other psychiatrist, who was treating common soldiers through literal torture, applying electric shock torture to these patients until they got themselves into a place of function again to get back to the front. But anyways, what it says here is, this other psychiatrist is named Yeland, and it said, obviously he and Yeland were both in the business of controlling people. Each of them fitted young men back into the role of warrior, a role they had, however unconsciously, rejected. He'd found himself wondering once or twice recently what possible meaning the restoration of mental health could have in relation to his work. Normally, a cure implies that the patient will no longer engage in behavior that is clearly self-destructive, but in present circumstances, recovery meant the resumption of activities that were not merely self-destructive, but positively suicidal. But then in a war, nobody is a free agent. He and Yeland were both locked in every bit as much as their patients were. And because of that, Rivers found that he really had to give up a lot of his own empathy. It says, his empathy, his strong sense of the humanity he shared with his patients, was again suspended, a necessary suspension, without which the practice of medical research, and indeed of medicine itself, would hardly be possible, but nonetheless identifiably the same suspension the soldier must achieve in order to kill, which is a very, very interesting comparison. And obviously, in order for a human to be able to kill another human, they have to get rid of any empathy they have for that person. And in this instance, for the doctor to effectively treat his patients, he had to suspend his own empathy. Now, if there's one consolation I have for my own PTSD, it's that the mental damage caused by dealing with the horrible, horrible things that happen to people means that I probably have a certain amount of empathy to begin with. Going back to this other doctor, this Yeland fellow, like I said, probably the most disturbing passage in this entire book wasn't with the frontline fighting, but was following this one physician who, like I said, he would take these common soldiers who, for instance, this one soldier who had gone mute because of his PTSD and the horror and trauma he'd experienced. And so this physician locked himself and his patient in a tiny room with Dr. Rivers to observe them. And he spent hours with electrical probes electrifying various parts of the patient's face, mouth, throat, other parts of his body, applying these increasingly painful electric jolts to the patient until first he started mumbling and then started talking a little bit, and then after hours and hours of torture, the patient was fully talking again, and the doctor said, all right, you're cured, you can go back to the front lines again. And so at one point, Rivers is feeling a little bit guilty about the means of treatment he has to apply to one of his patients, and yet he realizes it's not as bad as he's witnessed with this other physician. It says he'd tried everything with Moffat. No, he hadn't. He'd not, for example, tried attaching electrodes to Moffat's legs and throwing the switch, as Dr. Yeland would certainly have done by now. He'd not held tubes of radium against his skin till it burnt. He'd not given him subcutaneous injections of ether. All these things were being done to get men back to the front or keep them there. And talk about taking somebody who's injured and causing so much more trauma and injury. And then finally, here's this interesting comparison where it's not just the idea that the way they're treating mental injuries for the outcome that they're looking for is very questionable. There's also this case of physical injury and physical treatment, and one soldier in particular has had half his face and head blown off, yet is somehow still alive. So he's in the hospital here, and everybody knows this soldier's not going to make it. He is going to die eventually after he's finished his suffering and his body finally gives out. And Rivers is looking at him and comparing it to an experience that he had when he was working in some distant jungle tribe. I forget what country he was in with these tribe members, but anyways, when Rivers is looking at this horribly injured soldier, It says, "Why are you alive?" Rivers thought, looking down into the gargoyled face. Mate would have been Njiro's word for this. Njiro is the tribal medicine man that Rivers had sort of shadowed and gotten to know while he was with the tribe. So mate would have been Njiro's word for this, the state of which death is the appropriate and therefore the desirable outcome. He would have seen Hallett as being in every meaningful way dead already, and his sole purpose would have been to hasten the moment of actual death. Mate Ndapu, die, finish. Rivers fingered his lapel badge, his unimpaired nerves transmitting the shape of the caduceus to his undamaged brain, his allegiance to a different set of beliefs confirmed without the conflict ever breaking the surface of consciousness. And as I will do whenever I have the chance, I will take this back to a pet cause of mine, which is the idea of medical assistance in dying, and just how much it is necessary for anyone who has empathy for their fellow human beings and for the suffering of people who are dying. Moving on next to the issue of civilians and nations as a whole during wartime, and the things that the leaders of the nations need to convince their civilians of in order for war to even happen. We have this conversation that's being carried out between the soldier Pryor and the psychiatrist Rivers on the topic of civilians. Pryor saying, "You can't talk to anybody here," Pryor said. "Everybody's either lost somebody or knows somebody who has. They don't want the truth. It's like letters of condolences. Dear Mrs. Bloggs, your son had the side of his head blown off by a shell and took 5 hours to die. We did manage to give him a decent Christian burial. Unfortunately, that particular stretch of ground came under heavy bombardment the day after, so George has been back to see us 5 or 6 times since then. They don't want that. They want to be told that George, or Johnny, or whatever his name was, died a quick death and was given a decent send-off." He said deliberately, "Yesterday at the seaside, I felt as if I came from another planet." Later, we have another civilian who has wandered into a hospital looking for a friend, and she's accidentally wandered into the wrong ward where they have all the amputees and the soldiers who have been severely maimed that have been kept in sort of a back area out of general sight of the population. And she thinks to herself, if the country demanded that price, then it should bloody well be prepared to look at the results. Of course, it's not just lies and hiding of information regarding what's happening to the people on your own side. In order to get an entire nation mad enough to go and kill people from another nation, you have to have a pretty good propaganda wing that is convincing people of the inhumanity of the other side. And so we have a list of these absurd supposed things that the Germans, atrocities that the Germans have been perpetrating against people. So we're relatively late in the First World War, and things aren't going particularly well. Both sides are trenched down. Tens of thousands of people are dying. One of the generals had put out this statement, which was published in the newspapers, that said, "There is no other course open to us but to fight it out. Every position must be held to the last man. There must be no retirement. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight on to the end." Whatever effect the order had on the morale of the army, it had produced panic among civilians. Some women apparently were planning in all seriousness how they should kill themselves and their children when the Germans arrived. Those atrocity stories from the first months of the war had done the trick, rather too well. Nuns with their breasts cut off, priests hung upside down and used as clappers to ring their own bells. I'm all for that personally, but anyways. Not that there hadn't been atrocities, but prisoners of war were always the main victims, and the guilt was more evenly distributed than the press liked to think. Here's something I didn't know had happened. I guess these voluntary police forces were put together in various towns to try to uphold the law. And we have one woman talking about them saying, "Look, I had a woman come nosying around. The voluntary police, you know, they can come into your house or anything. They don't have to ask. And this one's a right old cow. I knew her before the war. She was all for women's rights. I says, what about my rights? Aren't I a woman? But there's no point arguing with them. They can get your money stopped. And anyway, it isn't right, is it? With Eddie at the front." And isn't that a familiar thing? Any hint of aggression from another nation and the government starts pulling your rights, your privacy, because we might be terrorists, so they can look at our private information anytime they want now, because what a great excuse for them to be able to do so. And then this final point, I think, hits the nail on the head when it comes to that sort of thing. Rivers is thinking to himself, as a young man, he'd been both by temperament and conviction deeply conservative, and not merely in politics. Now, in middle age, the sheer extent of the mess seemed to be forcing him into conflict with the authorities over a very wide range of issues, medical, military, whatever. A society that devours its own young deserves no automatic or unquestioning allegiance. Perhaps the rebellion of the old might count for rather more than the rebellion of the young. Well, I'm old, and I say, don't let the government tell our kids to go off to other nations to kill people. There's my protest. Of course, you bring religion into it, and everything gets cranked up to 100. Oh, gosh. Just by way of explanation, I'm a little embarrassed to say that for the first few decades of my life, I was all in on the whole Christianity bit. I was very, very devoted. I spent a lot of time studying theology, the Bible, really very much devoted to all of that until I started to think a little bit more objectively and learning a little bit about life outside of what I had grown up with. And if there's one thing I learned about Jesus and being a Christian, a Christ follower, is that you can't follow a person who said, if someone hits you in the face, just turn the other way, let them smack you on the other side too. Don't fight them back, don't use violence. You can't follow that person and find any means for violence in any circumstance. And this character seems to agree with me when he says, in conversation, so we have two soldiers talking to each other, one named Owen, one named Sassoon, who is the primary character of the first book. And Sassoon says to Owen, did you reach any conclusions? And Owen says, only that if I were to call myself a Christian, I'd have to call myself a pacifist as well. I don't think it's possible to call yourself a Christian and just leave out all the awkward bits. And Sassoon says, you'll never make a bishop. No, well, I think I can live with that. And it's wild that the fact that either of us would say such a thing could brew up such controversy if you actually study the texts and all that. This was also brought home to our character Prior at around Christmas time, who is writing a letter and says, and then we have to listen to all this puke about what we're fighting for. Still, it's better than it was before Christmas. I really did think I was going to throw up then. Peace on earth to men of goodwill, and how we were all showing goodwill by blowing up the Jerrys and saving gallant little Belgium. I tried to tell Stanford 6 what gallant little Belgium got up to in the Congo, but he soon put a stop to that. Oh man, there's context for you if you know what Belgium did do in the Congo, and you realize there's no good guys. There's never a good side. Well, I guess the Nazis were unequivocally the bad side in that particular war, but for the most part, when it comes to international conflict, it's all bad. And then there's this other woman who is comparing the Christian idea of abortion being murder, this idea that you abort a 2-month-old fetus, that's a terrible crime, but you can wholeheartedly support this war where hundreds of thousands are being killed. And so this lady says, you know, killing a baby when its mother's 2 months gone, that's a terrible crime. But wait 20 years and blow the same kid's head off, that's all right. I will say, though, to be fair, I'm not condemning Christians or Christianity as a whole in this regard. There are certainly Christian denominations who have this aspect of their theology, I think, bang on. People like the Quakers and the Mennonites who realize that they are following a peaceful person, and so they should live as peaceful people. I think get that absolutely right. But for those who do choose that route and became pacifist, they were treated as terrible, terrible criminals within their society during this time as well, which is, again, quite ironic. And we have this character talking about the folks in the mental hospital, how when they think they're cured, they have to go up before the board, and the board decides whether they are actually fit to be released and go back into service and so forth. And so they're the ones that kind of decide whether you're still sane or crazy and how fit you are to go back to the war. And talking about one fellow who was a pacifist or a moral objector, and he says, You see, William didn't get exemption. Partly he was unlucky with the board, but they don't like moral objectors anyway. If you're religious, doesn't matter how batty it is, you can say you've got the Holy Spirit in a jam jar on the mantelpiece. That's all right. That's fine. If you say, I think it's morally wrong for young men to be sent out to slaughter each other, God help you. The chairman of the board actually said to our William, you can't be a conscientious objector because you don't believe in God, and people who don't believe in God don't have consciences. Oh God, not much has changed. In fact, because of the insane fervor that this war instilled in the average person, it took an enormous amount of courage to be a pacifist. To not go out and fight and kill people took even this great deal of courage. So it says, in that climate, Beatty had found the courage to be a pacifist. But here's the reaction she got. People stopped going to her shop. If it hadn't been for the allotment, the family would have starved. So many bricks came through the window, they gave up having it mended and lived behind boards. Shit, canine and human, regularly plopped through the letterbox onto the carpet. In that isolation, in that semi-darkness, Beatty had sheltered deserters, and later, after the passing of the Conscription Act, conscientious objectors who'd been refused exemption. And she ultimately ended up getting arrested and tried and thrown in prison for being somebody who shelters people who refuse to go out and kill their fellow humans. This is going to lead to the final conclusions that I'm going to get to shortly here, but I'll conclude this theme with this funny rewrite that the soldiers did of the famous hymn called Onward Christian Soldiers, and this is their rewrite of it during the First World War. Forward, Joe Soap's army, marching without fear, with your brave commander safely in the rear. He boasts and skites from morn till night, and thinks he's very brave, but the men who really did the job are dead and in their grave. The next really interesting theme is this idea of class separation. So our character Pryor came from a working class, lower class background, ended up becoming an officer in the army, and thereby rubbing shoulders with people who had come from more higher class backgrounds, and he's essentially had to act like them in order to fit in with them. But one drum that he's banging throughout these books is the whole idea that in this environment of the trenches and constant death in your face, you would think that would be a unifying and leveling factor for everybody, but it absolutely wasn't. Even in those instances, class distinction was still an issue. And if you're watching this and thinking, well, thank goodness we don't have that in our society anymore, obviously you have not spent much time hanging out with people who are of very different socioeconomic background than yourself, whether they are much higher in that socioeconomic category or much lower. It very much exists in every aspect of our society today, unfortunately. And one of the very first times Pryor is complaining about this to the psychiatrist Rivers, Rivers asks Pryor, how did you fit in? Pryor, again, coming from that lower class background and rubbing shoulders with his fellow officers there. Pryor's face shut tight. You mean, did I encounter any snobbery? Yes. Not more than I have here. Their eyes locked. Rivers said, but you did encounter it? Yes. It's made perfectly clear when you arrive that some people are more welcome than others. It helps if you've been to the right school. It helps if you hunt. It helps if your shirts are the right color, which is a deep shade of khaki, by the way. And then skipping forward a few paragraphs, Pryor says, you mustn't make too much of it, the snobbery. I didn't, which absolutely isn't true. The only thing that really makes me angry is when people at home say there are no class distinctions at the front. Bollocks! What you wear, what you eat, where you sleep, what you carry. The men are pack animals. We have this other soldier who notices it as well. This guy is an officer who does come from a higher class background, and he's noticing how Pryor is taking on these affectations to make himself seem like a gentleman of higher class. And so he is kind of thinking to himself, at first, noting Pryor's flattened vowels, he thought, oh yes, temporary gentleman. A nasty, snobbish little phrase, but everybody used it, though obviously one tried not to use it in connection with people one liked. But the amazing thing was how persistent one's awareness of class distinction was. The mind seemed capable of making these minute social assessments in almost any circumstances. And he goes on to describe how even in the midst of battle at the front, he'd been affected by this inability to see everybody as equals. And speaking of equals, these gentlemen of better birth were actually called their betters. Again, this guy, in thinking about Prior, as the evening with Prior had gone on, the description temporary gentleman had come to seem less and less appropriate. It suggested one of those dreadful people, well, they were dreadful, who aped their betters, anxious to get everything right, and became, in the process, pallid, morally etiolated, and thoroughly nauseating. It's funny, he says it's nauseating that people tried to act like their betters, when this whole freaking thing is nauseating. Of course, this was normal in civilian life. We have Prior talking with another gentleman and saying, they're talking about a woman who was arrested and was being treated quite poorly by the authorities. B.D. Roper is a working class woman from the back streets of Salford. You don't give a fuck about her. I don't mean you personally, though that's true too. I mean your class. Manning was looking interested now rather than angry. You really do think class determines everything, don't you? Whether people are taken seriously or not? Yes. And then finally we have this really interesting comparison of the experience of war for the average lower class person in comparison to what the higher class officers were dealing with. One of the ways in which he felt different from his brother officers, one of the many, was that their England was a pastoral place. Fields, streams, wooded valleys, medieval churches surrounded by ancient elms. They couldn't grasp that for him, and for the vast majority of the men, the front, with its mechanization, its reduction of the individual to a cog in a machine, its blasted landscape, was not a contrast with the life they'd known at home in Birmingham or Manchester or Glasgow or the Welsh pit villages, but a nightmarish culmination. Equally not at home in either, Mac had said. He was right. Yeah, it's like the final destination of what they have been growing up with in their normal lives. One other thing that adds to the realism of these books is the fact that not everybody in here are heterosexual. We have characters who are gay and other characters who are bisexual. In fact, our main character, the psychiatrist Rivers, is gay. The other sort of co-main character, Prior, is bisexual. But they're living in a society where that is illegal. And so, of course, we run into this absurd contrast between if a young man blows up and kills another young man, that's fantastic, great job. But if a young man loves another young man, my God, throw him in prison, get him out of here. So even in our psychiatric hospital here, we have guys who are gay being sent there for treatment for their gayness. We have one person saying, so I went to Dr. Head, who has quite a reputation in the field. I was actually told so in so many words, quote, Henry Head can cure sodomites, unquote. And he said he couldn't do me. He was snowed under, and he recommended Rivers. So I went to him, and he said he'd take me on. The irony, of course, being that Rivers himself is gay, and he's being sent a gay man to cure him of his homosexuality. Where this really all comes to a head is in this trial, which was one of the legitimately true events that were included in the book, where, again, this is later in the war, things are not looking good, the war is dragging on, many are dying, and they do not seem to be making any progress, so the general population starts to panic, people start looking for scapegoats, and one of the things that somehow comes to the forefront is the fact that we have homosexuality in our nation, and that is what's destroying us and causing us to lose this war. So we have this actual trial that takes place where a list comes out with 47,000 names on it, supposedly of people who are not heterosexual, and is being headed by this fellow named Captain Harold Spencer. And again, this is all part of the true story that's being told here. The funny thing is the judge ends up being one of the possible homosexuals. Anyways, it says, the trial was presided over by Lord Justice Darling. Pemberton Billing defended himself. Having been identified early in the proceedings as one of the 47,000, Darling lost control of the court. The star defense witness was Harold Spencer. In addition to giving free rein to his obsession with women who had hypertrophied and diseased clitorises and therefore could be satisfied only by bull elephants, Spencer alleged that many members of the Asquith War Cabinet had been in the pay of the Germans, that Maud Allen was Asquith's wife's lover and a German agent, that many high-ranking officers in the British Army were Germans, and that persons who had the courage and patriotism to point out these facts were marooned on desert islands where they had to subsist on iron rations from submarines. Lord Alfred Douglas, another defense witness, seized the opportunity of pursuing his personal dispute with Robert Ross, Oscar Wilde's devoted friend and literary executor, identifying him as the leader of all the sodomites in London. After 6 days of chaos in the courtroom and hysteria in the newspapers, Pemberton Billing won the case and was carried shoulder high through cheering crowds that had gathered outside the Old Bailey. Later that year, Harold Spencer was certified insane. That really sounds like half the nation should have been certified insane with the fervor and panic that was happening around this crazy issue. And this final quote will wrap it up and lead directly into, like I said, what the overall, I think, theme is in terms of what the book is really about. And so we have Pryor, who has had a little tryst with another young man alongside a canal, and now he is sitting in a cellar with his fellow soldiers getting ready to be sent out on this offensive against the Germans. And he says, we're packed so tight in this cellar, my elbows constantly being jogged by people on either side. Cigarette smoke stings my eyes. I honestly believe if you ran out of fags here, you just need to breathe deeply. But I've got enough to last, even after my spasm of generosity on the canal bank, where he gave his lover some cigarettes, which this morning I reread in my journal, tore out and burned. Another canal bank meeting awaits, but this time the sort people approve of. Because they don't approve of him loving another man, they do approve of him going out to kill other German young men. And so the overall idea that I believe is being presented here with this examination of PTSD caused by the battlefield conditions that were just so traumatic and so beyond imagining in a lot of cases, is this idea that these soldiers who were broken by the events they experienced were deemed insane, were being sent to the hospital for treatment to cure their insanity so that they go back to the natural process of killing other humans. When really what is happening is that the insanity is the war. The insanity is the government convincing their population that they need to send their sons or their husbands out to kill and die, do these unspeakably horrific things to each other, and then as a natural consequence of their own humanity and empathy, breaking down mentally, experiencing these mental injuries as a result. It's not these soldiers who have gone mute, who have ceased to function, who have all these problems, these nightmares, who are insane. It's not them that are insane. It's the war itself that is insane. So we see this, I think, more clearly as the book goes on. We have this one instance where a soldier is describing how, in order to encourage the men to go forward through no man's land and get mowed down by German machine guns, they said, just set a soccer ball, or in the English term here, a football, and just kick a football across, and that'll help you move forward. Once again, Pryor, the soldier, is talking to Rivers, the psychiatrist, and says, you remember that story? The Suffolks kicking a football across no man's land when the whistles blew on the Somme? Bloody mad. No, the battle was mad. The football was sane. Whoever ordered them to do that was a very good psychologist. In fact, the whole entire situation was so insane that nobody really knew what was going on. And we have Pryor talking about a young recruit named Hallett who had sort of inserted himself into Pryor's life because obviously he was getting into this new situation and was scared and thought that maybe Pryor would be able to help him navigate it. And Pryor narrates, it's very obvious that Hallett's adopted me, like one of those little pilot fish, or the terns for that matter. He thinks because I've been out 3 times before, I know what's going on. Seems a bright enough lad. I wonder how long it'll take him to work out that nobody knows what's going on. And so we have Rivers, the psychiatrist, putting 2 and 2 together and figuring things out. And he is narrating, every case posed implicit questions about the individual costs of the war, and never more so than in the run-up to a round of medical boards when the medical officers had to decide which men were fit to return to duty. This would have been easier if he could have believed, as Louis Yeeland, for example, believed, that men who broke down were degenerates whose weakness would have caused them to break down eventually, even in civilian life, but Rivers could see no evidence of that. The vast majority of his patients had no record of any mental trouble, and as soon as you accepted that the man's breakdown was a consequence of his war experience rather than of his own innate weakness, then inevitably the war became the issue. And right near the end of the book, we have Pryor summing this up in a somewhat ironic manner in his own journal, where he has been cured at the psychiatric hospital and been sent back to the front lines to go on killing and dying. And he writes, "My nerves are in perfect working order, by which I mean that in my present situation, the only sane thing to do is to run away, and I will not do it. Test passed? Question mark?" What he's saying here is that because his body and mind are functioning properly, the only sane response to what he is being put into, the machine gun fire of the Germans, would be to run away. That would be the sane, natural reaction. However, the definition of sanity by everybody else in his society is that he will stand up against the machine gun bullets and push forward. And so he says, yay, I've passed the test of my society's sanity because I will not run away from certain death, but will instead plod forward into the machine gun bullets, and how completely backwards and upside down the whole thing is. So war, as always, is inhumanity. It is inhuman actions being perpetrated by humans on humans. And as in all wars, when soldiers leave that environment and come back to the normal human environment of regular society, it is so discombobulating and confusing. One of the soldiers who has done so says, "I still can't get used to ordinary noises, especially women's and children's voices. You must feel like this coming out of prison." And once again, that's a really, really interesting comparison, because I think the two most inhumane things in human society are war and locking people up in cages in prison. Now, our justice system, the way we handle justice and crime and criminals, could be another whole entire video or a whole entire series of videos, but it's I think a very, very accurate point, where you hear soldiers talk about returning to society after war and combat, and you hear about prisoners who are released from prison after a long sentence and have to somehow reincorporate into society, how both people coming from this really inhuman environment, coming back into the normal world, they can't adjust to it, and we are a worse society as a result. We see all the terrible things that happen when we don't allow our soldiers or our prisoners to readjust to life as it should be lived in a society. But I guess if there's good news is, despite what humans may do to each other and what the human race is ultimately capable of, which is our own annihilation, the earth will continue. Nature will live on. We have this paragraph. "Marched all day through utter devastation. Dead horses, unburied men, stench of corruption. Sometimes you look at this, craters, stinking mud, stagnant water, trees like gigantic burnt matches, and you think the land can't possibly recover. It's poisoned. Poisons dripped into it from rotting men, dead horses, gas. It will, of course. 50 years from now, a farmer will be plowing these fields and turn up skulls. And those who study history will go, all those men died for what? Because of the utter insanity of war and what it turns us into." So yeah, the Regeneration trilogy is an excellent anti-war series. Like the most effective anti-war novels, it just simply and factually presents things as they are. It presents what happened and the effects on people that it has. And hopefully we learn from that. As far as what I would rate the book, that's a really difficult question, because while it is very well written and it explores all these really interesting and, I would argue, very important themes, it's not a fun read. And being pretty light on plot, it's also not a book that keeps you pushing forward to see what happens next. It is a book that I would pick up to read in the evening as I normally do, and I would obviously get a lot out of reading the book, but I wouldn't find myself pushing to read the next chapter late into the night because I was really invested with what was going on. So, in fact, even these main characters themselves aren't particularly likable, other than maybe the psychiatrist Rivers seemed like a likable guy who was sort of thrust into this role of being a father figure almost to these young soldiers who were coming to him for help, even though he didn't want to be in that role. He just wanted to do his job and make them better, but he also did kind of want to take on that role because he cared for them. So he seemed like a decent guy. Everybody else in the book just seems like normal people, not particularly inspiring or likable, just sort of average folks. And so yeah, it wasn't a super enjoyable read that I looked forward to getting to every evening, but it was one that I did take a lot out of. And so because of that, it's super hard to give this a numerical rating. I think the best I could do is maybe give it an 8 out of 10 as being really an excellent book, not being a top favorite necessarily, but I don't know. I think that's the best I got for a rating. If I brought up anything in all of this that you want to chat about, definitely get into the comments and let's carry on the conversation in any way you'd like to. Other than that, I would also just be interested in hearing what books you're currently reading. Are there any books you've recently read that really were amongst your favorites? I would really love to hear about any of that, so please do let me know. And thank you so much for watching. Cheers. Struck out to me. We have this one. We have this conversation that is being carried out by the soldier prior with... We have this conversation that's being carried out. Whatever effect the order had on the morale of the army, it had produced... One of the first times Rivers is complaining about this too, which is a deep shade of cocky inability to, even in our head that are in and like the most anti-war I mean, my battery is almost dead. God damn it.